I never thought moving into my dream home would lead me into a war over electricity. When I first bought the house, the neighborhood looked perfect, quiet, green, and full of polite smiles, the kind of place where people waved when you drove by, and lawns stayed trimmed, as if maintained by invisible gardeners. But under that calm surface, there was something darker, something I wouldn't notice until it was too late. It started small. A letter from the HOA slipped under my door the first week I moved in. It wasn't a welcome note. It was a warning about unauthorized exterior lighting. Apparently, my porch bulb was too bright and in violation of the neighborhood tone. I thought it was a mistake, a simple misunderstanding. But it wasn't. It was my first glimpse into how this HOA operated, through intimidation, gossip, and people like Karen. Karen was the self-proclaimed enforcer of the HOA rules, the kind of woman who didn't just read the handbook, she lived by it. Every day, she walked her dog around the block, scanning houses like a security camera in yoga pants. If she spotted even a garden gnome slightly out of alignment, she'd report it by noon. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her name. Nobody wanted to be on her bad side. But somehow, I ended up there fast. It all began when a storm knocked out part of the neighborhood's power grid. I called an electrician to check my line, and he told me the easiest fix was through the utility easement, a small strip of land behind my fence, technically shared between me and the HOA for maintenance. He replaced some cables, got the power back, and everything was fine for a few days. Until Karen saw it. She claimed I had violated the property access policy by allowing a contractor into the easement without prior HOA approval. The next morning, I received a formal notice taped to my door, signed by Karen herself as Acting Compliance Chair. The letter said the HOA had opened an investigation into unauthorized electrical work and potential rule breach. At first, I laughed. It was ridiculous, but the laughter didn't last long. 2 days later, my house went dark. Not just a tripped breaker, completely dark. No power. The fridge stopped humming. My security cameras went offline, and even the streetlight in front of my driveway went dead. I called the power company thinking it was another outage, but they told me the line to my property had been temporarily disabled, pending authorization. When I asked who gave that authorization, the name on record was the HOA. That's when it hit me. Karen had actually convinced the HOA board to block my electricity. I called the board president, but he avoided my calls. I went to the office in person, and Karen was already there, sitting behind the front desk like she owned the place. She told me I had tampered with restricted infrastructure, and until the board's review was complete, the easement access was suspended, meaning I couldn't reconnect my power without their permission. Days passed. I had no lights, no hot water, no way to cook. The food in my fridge spoiled, and I had to shower at the gym just to stay clean. My house, my own home, became unlivable overnight, and every time I stepped outside, Karen would be there, smiling, watching. Neighbors whispered. Some offered help quietly, others just avoided me. The rumor was that I had caused a major electrical hazard by tampering with HOA property. Karen made sure everyone heard that version. But what nobody knew was that she had been planning this. I found out through an electrician friend that the HOA had been negotiating a private maintenance contract for the entire neighborhood with a company owned by Karen's brother-in-law. She needed a reason to make my property non-compliant, so they could justify adding the new contract to fix it at my expense. It was all about money and control. By week 2, I was at my breaking point. I'd filed multiple complaints with the county utility board, but they said their hands were tied because it was an easement access dispute. My lawyer told me it was rare, but technically possible, for an HOA to request a suspension if they claimed a rule violation. Karen knew exactly how to exploit that loophole. I tried reasoning with her once, caught her outside during one of her dog walks, and asked her to just tell me what it would take to resolve this. She didn't answer. She just smiled and said, "Rules are rules. Maybe next time you'll read the handbook." That's when I realized this wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. She wanted me gone. Nights were the hardest. Sitting in a cold, dark house, using my car's USB port to charge my phone, listening to the hum of distant generators from my neighbors' yards while mine stayed silent. Every sound felt louder, every creak, every rustle outside. I started sleeping in the living room with a flashlight, half expecting Karen to appear at my window with another notice. But then, something unexpected happened. One morning, I found a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single piece of paper, a copy of the HOA's internal meeting minutes. It had been anonymously delivered. And on that paper, I saw Karen's name, listed as the person who recommended suspension of electrical access to property number 34 due to safety concerns. But right next to it was another note, handwritten by someone else on the board. We could face liability if the homeowner takes legal action. That was my proof. I finally had a document connecting Karen directly to the decision and evidence that the HOA knew it was wrong. That night I sat in my car under the dim light of the dashboard and made a decision. Enough was enough. I was going to fight back, not just against Karen, but against the entire HOA. I contacted a property rights attorney the next morning. He listened carefully, reviewed the document, and told me I had a solid case. If they've interfered with a utility easement without legal authority, he said, that's trespass and deprivation of essential services. You can sue. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Small, but real. I wasn't powerless anymore. But Karen wasn't done yet. A few days after I filed the legal notice, I woke up to find my front yard covered in bright orange flags. Property under review, HOA compliance pending. She had escalated again, marking my home as a public example. My driveway was blocked by cones, my mailbox sealed, pending inspection. It wasn't just harassment anymore, it was war, and as I watched her walking down the street that morning, clipboard in hand, whispering to a neighbor, I knew one thing for sure. This fight was only getting started. The moment I filed the lawsuit, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. People stopped waving. Conversations fell silent when I walked by. The same neighbors who once smiled at me now pretended not to see me at all. It was as if Karen had flipped a switch, and suddenly I was the villain of my own street. The HOA office began sending me letters almost daily. Notice of non-compliance. Violation of property maintenance standards. Failure to remove improper signage. Each one came with a fine attached. $50 here, $100 there, all meant to bleed me dry while the court process dragged on. But I didn't cave. I kept every notice, every envelope, every timestamp. My lawyer told me to document everything, and I did. Even the way Karen stared at me from her porch every evening, phone in hand, pretending to record evidence. Meanwhile, the house remained without power. My attorney had filed an emergency motion demanding that the HOA restore my electrical access until the case was resolved. But Karen pushed back, insisting it was a safety hazard. She even submitted fake photos of damaged wires behind my property, photos that didn't match my home at all. The judge ordered an inspection. That's when the truth started to unravel. The county inspector arrived one humid morning, clipboard in hand. He examined the easement, took photos, and frowned. The power lines were intact. The supposed damage Karen had reported didn't exist. Instead, he found that a temporary lock had been physically installed on the junction box, with a padlock marked HOA access only. In other words, someone from the HOA had literally locked my power out. When the report came back, My lawyer's tone changed. He called it intentional interference with utility access, a direct violation of both state property law and utility regulation. Suddenly, my small case wasn't small anymore. But Karen refused to back down. She began posting updates on the community bulletin, painting herself as a hero, protecting the neighborhood from unsafe electrical work. She used words like reckless and dangerous homeowner. Some people believed her, others didn't. But by then, the damage to my reputation was done. One night, I caught her standing at the edge of my driveway, holding a flashlight, pointing it at the side of my house. When I stepped outside, she pretended to be inspecting the streetlight. I knew what she was doing, trying to provoke me into reacting. So I said nothing. I just recorded her, time-stamped it, and sent the clip to my lawyer. Every time she tried to intimidate me, I turned it into evidence. Weeks went by. The court date was set. But the stress was taking a toll. I was still living without power, eating out every night, showering at the gym, sleeping in a house that felt like an empty shell. The hum of other homes, their air conditioners, TVs, laughter, reminded me how isolated I'd become. Still, I refused to leave. That's what Karen wanted. She wanted me to break, to sell the house at a loss, to give her another victory in her long list of HOA triumphs. Then came the breaking point. I woke up one morning to the sound of drilling outside. When I stepped onto my porch, I saw two contractors digging near the easement. Again. They told me they were authorized by the HOA to conduct maintenance, but when I asked for their permit, they had none. I filmed the entire thing. Turns out Karen had hired them herself, using community funds to correct code violations. She was now spending HOA money on a personal vendetta. That clip became crucial. My lawyer included it in the evidence package alongside the inspector's report and the meeting minutes I'd received anonymously. The case file was thick now, full of proof that this wasn't just mismanagement, it was targeted harassment. When the hearing day finally arrived, I expected Karen to show up in her usual smug confidence. But she didn't. She walked into the courtroom dressed neatly, clutching a folder with that same fake composure she always carried. Behind her sat two other board members, silent, uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. The judge reviewed the evidence. He read the inspector's report out loud, the part about the padlocked junction box. Then he looked directly at Karen and asked who had authorized it. She hesitated, then tried to shift blame onto a collective board decision. But when pressed further, she admitted she had suggested the temporary suspension for safety reasons. My lawyer handed over the meeting minutes, the ones with her handwritten recommendation. The judge raised an eyebrow. Karen froze. The room fell silent. That was the moment everything shifted. The judge ruled in my favor, a temporary injunction ordering the HOA to immediately restore full electrical access to my property. He also set a follow-up hearing to discuss damages and potential misuse of funds. Karen's face went pale. I walked out of that courtroom with my lawyer beside me, the sound of papers shuffling behind us, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally being heard. 2 days later, the power company arrived to reconnect my electricity. I stood outside watching as they cut off the padlock and flipped the switch. The house came alive again. Lights flickered on, the refrigerator hummed back to life, and the quiet air filled with the low buzz of normalcy. It was such a simple sound, but it felt like victory. Still, I knew it wasn't over. Karen wouldn't let it end there. That evening, I saw her pacing on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, whispering angrily into it. She looked furious, like someone who had lost control for the first time. By the end of the week, rumors began spreading again. The HOA newsletter announced an upcoming special vote to review misconduct allegations within the board. It was clear. The other members were turning on her, but before they could remove her, she made one last, desperate move. Late one night, I noticed headlights outside my house. A car parked across the street. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my mailbox. Another fine, this time for non-compliant security lighting. The strange part? I hadn't even installed any lights since the power came back. It was just the same porch bulb she had complained about months earlier. It was her way of sending a message. She wasn't done yet. But I had learned something she hadn't. Patience. Karen ran on emotion and control. I ran on evidence. I didn't need to fight her on the sidewalk anymore. The courtroom was my battlefield, and she was already losing. As the next hearing approached, my lawyer uncovered something even more explosive. Bank statements showing that the HOA's maintenance funds had been used to pay Karen's brother-in-law's company for consulting fees. The exact company tied to the fake electrical repair she had staged. When we added that to the evidence file, my attorney smiled for the first time. "This isn't just harassment anymore," he said. "This is financial misconduct." And just like that, the story turned from a personal feud into a full-blown scandal. I remember sitting in my now brightly lit living room that night, hearing the steady hum of electricity through the walls, and realizing something. Karen had started this war thinking she could control me by cutting my power. But in doing so, she'd exposed herself, and the entire corrupt system behind her. The final hearing was set for the following week. Karen had no idea what was about to hit her. The morning of the final hearing felt different. For months, I had lived under constant tension, the silence of my dark home, the whispers of neighbors, the constant weight of Karen's eyes on me. But that morning, as I left for court, I felt calm. Because this time, the truth wasn't just on my side. It was undeniable. The HOA's corruption was no longer just rumor or suspicion. My lawyer had gathered every piece of evidence, the falsified photos, the padlocked junction box, the forged inspection reports, and most importantly, the bank statements. Each page painted a picture of deceit, of personal greed hidden under the mask of community enforcement. When I walked into the courtroom, I could feel eyes turning toward me. Karen was already seated at the defendant's table, her usual smug composure gone. She looked pale, her shoulders tight, hands clasped together in a nervous rhythm. Behind her sat two members of the HOA board, the same ones who had avoided eye contact last time. Now, they wouldn't even sit close to her. The hearing began quietly. The judge reviewed the prior injunction and then turned to my lawyer. "Proceed." What followed felt like watching months of pain unfold in slow motion, except this time, it was happening to her. My lawyer laid out everything. He started with the internal HOA meeting minutes, the document that first exposed Karen's handwritten recommendation to suspend electrical access. Then came the inspector's report, confirming that the junction box was locked intentionally by the HOA. The courtroom grew quiet, but the real blow came next. He projected the financial records onto the screen, line after line of payments made from the HOA maintenance fund to a company registered under Karen's brother-in-law. KJ Electrical Consulting. Over $18,000 paid for inspection services that never occurred. The judge leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming it was standard maintenance outsourcing. But when asked to produce the contracts or work reports, she had nothing. Not a single signed document, not a receipt, not even a proof of service. The courtroom filled with a tense silence. I could almost feel her unraveling in real time. Then came the witness statements. One of the board members, the same person who had anonymously slipped the meeting minutes under my door, testified. They admitted that Karen had pressured the board into voting for my electrical suspension, claiming I was a danger to the community. When other members hesitated, she allegedly said, "We'll teach him not to cross the HOA." The judge listened without emotion, taking notes, but when the board member mentioned that Karen had personally ordered the padlock installation, the judge finally looked up, eyes sharp, voice firm. "Mrs. Avery," he said, addressing Karen by her full name, "did you at any point authorize or direct the physical restriction of electrical access to the plaintiff's property?" Karen stuttered. She tried to twist her words, saying it was a misunderstanding of procedure. But by then, the damage was done. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours. I barely spoke. I didn't have to. The documents spoke for me. The evidence spoke louder than anything I could ever say. When the judge finally gave his verdict, the entire courtroom fell silent. He ruled in my favor on all counts. The HOA was found guilty of unlawful interference with utility easement access, malicious misuse of authority, and negligent financial management of community funds. The judge ordered the HOA to reimburse me for all damages, including the cost of alternative living arrangements, legal fees, and 3 months of lost utility use, with interest.
But that wasn't the only consequence.
The court also referred Karen's financial dealings to the county auditor's office for further investigation. Meaning, she wasn't just losing her position, she was facing potential criminal charges. The board sat frozen, whispering among themselves. Karen didn't look up once. When the gavel came down, she just sat there, hands trembling, face pale, staring at the papers in front of her like she still couldn't believe what had happened. For me, it felt surreal. Months of exhaustion, frustration, and fear, all dissolving in a single moment of justice. When I walked out of the courthouse, the sunlight felt different. Warmer, cleaner, the kind of light you don't notice until you've lived too long without power. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood began to change too. The HOA held an emergency election. Karen was officially removed as compliance chair, and the president resigned shortly after. A new board took over, one that immediately contacted me to apologize and negotiate settlement terms. They also released a public notice admitting fault for the mismanagement of electrical access and promised new rules to prevent similar abuse. Word spread fast. Neighbors who had once avoided me began stopping by again, offering quiet apologies, sometimes awkward smiles. A few even admitted they'd been afraid to cross Karen, worried she'd target them next. And as for Karen, she disappeared. Her house went up for sale within a month. I'd see the for sale sign in her yard every time I walked past, and eventually it was gone. Nobody saw her pack. Nobody said goodbye.
It was like she vanished.
Overnight, the woman who once tried to run the entire neighborhood, reduced to a cautionary story, whispered at block parties. The day my settlement payment arrived, I remember opening the envelope slowly. The check wasn't just money, it was validation, proof that no matter how powerful someone pretends to be, the truth still matters. The funds covered everything I'd lost, every spoiled meal, every night spent in darkness, every hour of stress and humiliation. But the best part wasn't the money. It was the note my lawyer handed me afterward. It was a letter from the county office confirming that the HOA had been fined for tampering with a public utility, and that part of that fine would go toward upgrading the neighborhood's electrical system. In a strange way, Karen's power trip ended up improving the very thing she'd tried to control. Now, months later, I still live in the same house. The lights shine brighter than ever, not because of new bulbs, but because I appreciate them in a way I never did before. Sometimes, when I sit on my porch at night, I think back to those long, dark weeks. The cold air, the empty rooms, the silence that used to make my chest tighten. And I remember how one person's obsession with control nearly made me homeless. But I also remember how it ended, not with fear, but with justice. Karen thought she could cut my power to force me out. Instead, she cut her own lifeline to the community she tried to rule. And if there's one thing I learned from all this, it's that power isn't about control, it's about integrity, because when you try to take it from others, eventually you lose your own.